Amidst the morning rush, an 84-year-old man named Thomas stepped into the bakery. His hair was thin and white, his eyes carried the weight of countless stories, and his hands gripped an old, weathered cane. The air was rich with the aroma of freshly baked bread, mingled with the cheerful chatter of the morning crowd. The bakery was a place alive with warmth, but to Thomas, it felt colder than the sharpest winter wind. He moved slowly, each step a careful negotiation, until he stood before the glass counter filled with golden pastries and warm loaves. His fingers, trembling slightly, touched the edge of the counter as he drew in a deep breath. "Excuse me," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Could I have a piece of bread? I don't have any money today, but I promise to pay you back." Lisa, a young woman in her 20s with perfectly tied back hair and a crisp apron, looked up from the cash register. Her eyes met Thomas's, but instead of softening with understanding, they hardened with impatience. She let out an audible sigh, rolling her eyes. "Sir, this isn't a charity," she said flatly. Her words were sharp, cutting deeper than she realized. A few customers glanced over, some with fleeting pity, others with indifference. A chuckle came from a table where 3 young men were sipping their coffee and exchanging stories about the weekend. "Look at that," one of them muttered. "Times really must be tough." Thomas stood there, the hope in his eyes dimming as he tried to straighten his back, holding on to the last shreds of his dignity. The bakery, once his place of comfort and familiarity, felt like a stage where he was the unwilling actor in a scene of silent judgment. In the far corner of the room, seated with a steaming cup of black coffee and a newspaper spread open before him, sat John. He was a man in his early 40s, dressed in a suit that spoke of success, but with eyes that held a deeper understanding of life's hardships. He noticed the scene unfolding at the counter and felt a pang in his chest. Memories of his own past flooded back. The days when he and his father had barely enough to eat, and the kindness of strangers was the only thing that kept them going. John folded his newspaper and stood up, each step toward the counter deliberate. The murmur of conversations faltered as people noticed him walking up to Thomas. "I'll pay for his bread," John said, his voice steady and warm. He looked at Lisa with a calm, unwavering gaze. "And make sure it's fresh." The young woman's face flushed a deep shade of red. She nodded silently, fumbling to package a warm loaf. The trio at the table stopped chuckling, their smiles replaced with expressions of mild discomfort. Thomas's eyes, filled with surprise and gratitude, locked on to John's. You don't have to do this," Thomas managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. His hands shook as he reached out to take the loaf Lisa handed over the counter, now warm in his palms. John smiled gently. "Everyone needs a helping hand sometimes. And sometimes, helping is just the right thing to do," he said, giving a reassuring nod. Thomas's lips trembled into a smile, one that spoke of relief and a gratitude that words couldn't capture. The room, which had been filled with whispers and sideways glances, fell into an uneasy silence as people averted their eyes or exchanged awkward looks. The weight of the moment seemed to settle over everyone, but none felt it as deeply as Thomas. "Thank you," he whispered, gripping the loaf as though it were a lifeline. His voice faltered, and tears welled up in his eyes, tracing paths down his weathered cheeks. "You don't know what this means to me." John, moved by the sincerity in the old man's voice, put a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Why don't we sit and talk for a bit?" he suggested, gesturing to an empty table near the window. Thomas hesitated, then nodded, still clutching the bread as they moved to the table. The sounds of the bakery resumed, but now there was an underlying tension, a reminder that empathy was more than just a word. It was a choice, a moment when silence could be broken by action. As they sat, Thomas looked out of the window at the bustling street, the morning sun casting long shadows across the pavement. He felt a small warmth in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. It was hope, fragile but real. "John, I don't know how to thank you," Thomas said after a moment, breaking the silence between them. He looked down at the bread, then back up at the man who had shown him kindness when he needed it most. John smiled, taking a sip of his coffee. "You don't need to thank me, Thomas. Just tell me about yourself. Everyone has a story, and I'd like to hear yours." Thomas's eyes grew distant, as if he was looking back through the decades. The hum of the bakery faded, replaced by the echoes of laughter, the scent of warm pastries, and the memory of a place that once was more than just a shop. It was home. And as he began to speak, the bakery unknowingly braced itself for a story that would reveal truths and memories long forgotten, ones that would bind everyone in that room in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The golden morning light streamed through the bakery's window, casting warm reflections on the polished floor and illuminating the faces of the customers, who were now subtly glancing at the table where Thomas and John sat. The quiet buzz of conversation filled the room once more, but the intensity had shifted. Whispers of curiosity now mingled with the clinking of coffee cups. Thomas shifted in his seat, his hands trembling slightly as they rested on the loaf of bread before him. For a moment, silence enveloped them, and John waited patiently, recognizing the weight of what might come. With a deep breath, Thomas's gaze softened, his eyes misting over as he began to speak. "Decades ago, this bakery was more than just a place to buy bread. It was a sanctuary, built by my own hands and filled with laughter, the scent of cinnamon, and the warmth of my wife, Margaret," he said, a wistful smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The sound of her name caught in his throat, and he paused, swallowing down the emotion. John leaned forward, listening intently, aware that the entire bakery seemed to be straining to catch every word. Thomas's voice steadied as he continued. "Margaret and I opened this place when we were young, full of dreams and boundless energy. We would wake before the sun, kneading dough and crafting recipes that would bring people from all over. It wasn't just our livelihood, it was our life." Lisa, the young cashier, stood motionless behind the counter, her earlier irritation replaced by a pang of guilt. She felt a tightness in her chest as she watched Thomas speak, the shame of her earlier behavior stinging deeper than she could have anticipated. One winter night, Thomas's voice dropped, and the warmth in his expression faded, replaced by shadows of loss. A fire swept through this very place. It was so sudden. The flames devoured everything we had built in what felt like moments. We tried to rebuild, but debt came before hope. And Margaret, he stopped, his voice breaking as he looked down at the table, the bread now forgotten between them. John reached out instinctively, placing a comforting hand over Thomas's. "She couldn't bear it," Thomas whispered, the silence that followed heavy and mournful. The room felt smaller, more intimate, as if everyone inside shared the grief of that memory. The once cheerful clatter of the bakery had all but ceased, leaving only the hum of the street outside and the occasional soft rustle as someone shifted uncomfortably. John's brows knitted together in sympathy. He felt a familiar ache, a reminder of his own losses. "Thomas, I'm so sorry for what you went through," he said, his voice low but resolute. "I can't even imagine the strength it took to survive that." Thomas looked up, his eyes now glistening with unshed tears. "Survive," he echoed with a sad chuckle. That's what it was, survival. But life without Margaret, without this place, it was a life half-lived. He glanced around, noting the new decor, the modern fixtures, and the unfamiliar faces that now filled what once had been his world. "I never stepped back in here until today," he admitted. Lisa's eyes widened, a wave of understanding crashing over her. This wasn't just any customer she had turned away. This man was the heart and history of the very place she worked. Her stomach churned with regret and she silently vowed to make it right. John leaned back slightly, taking in the weight of Thomas's story. The echoes of loss and resilience resonated with him deeply, making him think of his own father's stories of struggle and generosity. The man who'd stood at the brink of losing everything but had never lost his kindness. The doorbell chimed as another customer walked in, breaking the somber spell. Thomas glanced toward the sound, his face momentarily softening as he saw a young mother with her child, the little boy's eyes wide with excitement as he pointed to a basket of muffins. It was a scene Thomas had witnessed countless times, one that now reminded him of the simpler joys he had lost and longed for. "Thomas," John said, drawing his attention back, "there's more to the story, isn't there? Something tells me this bakery isn't the only chapter left unfinished." Thomas nodded slowly, the ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "Yes, there is. But whether the rest of it will be written, I'm not sure." Outside, the morning sun climbed higher, casting a brighter light over the city, hinting at the promise of new beginnings. Inside, the atmosphere in the bakery was thick with anticipation, as if everyone could sense that Thomas's return marked not just a visit, but the start of something greater. The days that followed Thomas's emotional return to the bakery were marked by a subtle shift in the air. Word of his story spread beyond the bakery's doors, carried on hushed conversations over morning coffee and murmurs at neighborhood gatherings. The tale of the elderly man who once owned the very place now stood at the center of community chatter, tugging at the hearts of those who remembered and those who wished they had known. Thomas came back every day, always finding a quiet spot by the window. He would sip on a cup of black coffee, watching the city pass by, a silent witness to lives that seemed far removed from his own. Lisa, who had taken upon herself to make amends, always made sure Thomas's coffee was fresh and his table was clean. She would often exchange polite smiles with him, unsure of how to bridge the gap that guilt had carved between them. John, on the other hand, visited as often as his busy schedule allowed. He would join Thomas whenever he could, their conversations weaving between memories of the past and quiet moments of shared understanding. It wasn't long before the story of Thomas and John's encounter became more than a tale of one man's hardships. It became a symbol of resilience and community spirit. One morning, as Thomas sat by the window, a knock on the glass startled him from his reverie. He looked up to see a group of older patrons, faces lined with years and stories, smiling at him. They waved, and Thomas, caught off guard, waved back hesitantly. A man named Harold, who had frequented the bakery decades ago, stepped inside, his cane clicking rhythmically against the tiled floor. "Thomas," Harold greeted, his voice gravelly but warm. "You don't remember me, do you?" Thomas squinted, recognition flickering behind his tired eyes. "Harold, I do remember. You were the one who always ordered that ridiculous cherry pie Margaret swore was too sweet." Harold laughed, a sound that seemed to erase years between them. "That's right. I never could resist it." The two men shook hands, the gesture steeped in the weight of shared history. Other familiar faces followed, people who had known Thomas and Margaret during the bakery's golden days. Soon, the corner of the room where Thomas sat was filled with chatter, laughter, and reminiscing. Lisa watched from behind the counter, her heart swelling at the scene. The once quiet man who had entered, frail and invisible, was now surrounded by warmth and familiarity. Determined to do more, she took a deep breath and approached the table. "Excuse me, Mr. Thomas," she said, her voice steady but soft. "I was wondering if you might share one of your old recipes with us. Maybe we could bake it together and serve it as a tribute to you and Margaret." Thomas's eyes widened, surprise mingled with an emotion that tightened his throat. He looked around at the expectant faces of his old friends and at Lisa, who now looked at him with sincerity instead of indifference. He nodded slowly, the corners of his lips curling into a smile. "I'd like that very much." John, who had entered unnoticed and stood watching from a distance, felt a surge of pride. He had always believed that acts of kindness had a ripple effect, and seeing Thomas surrounded by the past and present, united by shared memories, was proof of that belief. The day turned into an impromptu reunion. The bakery buzzed with stories of old escapades and recollections of Margaret's laughter that once filled the space. Lisa brought out a pen and paper, ready to jot down every detail of the recipe Thomas shared, his voice steady and sure as he recalled the precise measurements and secret touches that had once made the bakery the heart of the neighborhood. Outside, passers-by paused at the sight of the lively scene through the window. They smiled, not knowing the full story but understanding, in some way, that something special was unfolding inside. As the hours passed, and the sky shifted from the bright blue of morning to the deep hues of late afternoon, Thomas felt a warmth spread through him that went beyond the walls of the bakery. For the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving, he was living, surrounded by echoes of love, friendship, and a sense of belonging that he thought had been lost forever. And while the day drew to a close, one thing became clear. The story that began with loss and longing was now being rewritten by the hands of those willing to remember and rebuild. The following week, the bakery's early morning quiet was broken by the sound of laughter and the warm hum of conversation. Thomas stood behind the counter, his hands dusted with flour as he prepared to recreate one of his and Margaret's beloved recipes. Lisa stood beside him, her apron already smudged with remnants of dough, a grin on her face that was both nervous and excited. "Are you sure you remember all the steps, Mr. Thomas?" Lisa asked, her voice carrying a playful note. Thomas chuckled, the sound resonating with a strength that hadn't been there before. "I may be old, Lisa, but my memory's still sharp when it comes to this." He winked, and for a moment, the weight of his years seemed to lift, replaced by the youthful energy that once drove him to wake before dawn and bake through the night. John arrived just as the first batch of dough was being kneaded. He leaned against the doorframe, taking in the scene. The bakery, filled with the familiar scent of rising bread and soft chatter, felt transformed. The spirit of the place had shifted from a simple business to a gathering spot full of heart and shared purpose. "Need an extra set of hands?" John called out, moving to join them behind the counter. The room burst into a chorus of encouragements and cheers as others offered to pitch in. Customers from the neighborhood, old and young alike, lined up not just for pastries, but for the experience of watching the past come alive. "All right, everyone," Thomas said, looking up and letting his eyes sweep across the room. "This is not just any bread. This is Margaret's special loaf. And today, we're making it together." A round of applause rippled through the bakery. Lisa began mixing ingredients under Thomas's careful instructions, adding pinches of this and that, as he corrected her with a playful scold. "Not too much cinnamon, young lady." Margaret always said too much cinnamon turned smiles into grimaces, he joked, drawing more laughter. As the day unfolded, the bakery's warmth was tangible. The windows fogged slightly from the oven's heat, and the scent of spices and baked goods spilled out onto the street, drawing in passers-by who couldn't help but stop and peek inside. Harold, the old customer from days past, stepped forward with a photograph in hand. "Thomas, do you remember this?" He passed it to Thomas, who took it with trembling hands. It was an old sepia-toned picture of him and Margaret standing proudly in front of the bakery, arms wrapped around each other, and smiles as bright as the sun. Thomas stared at the photo, his eyes glistening with memories. "I remember," he said, his voice soft and reverent. "This place was her dream as much as mine, and seeing it full of life again, she would have loved this." John, sensing the moment's significance, stepped forward and placed a reassuring hand on Thomas's shoulder. "She's here, Thomas. In every loaf, in every smile, in every story shared within these walls." Thomas nodded, a tear slipping down his cheek. The room fell silent for a brief moment, the air thick with emotion. Then, as if on cue, the oven's timer chimed, pulling everyone back into the present. Lisa opened the door, revealing the perfectly golden loaves inside. The aroma that filled the room was met with murmurs of approval and anticipation. Thomas took a deep breath, the smell of cinnamon and warm bread carrying him back through time. He reached out, slicing into one of the loaves and handing a piece to Lisa. "Go on, try it." Lisa took a bite, her eyes lighting up as the flavors hit her palate. "It's perfect," she said, unable to hide the delight in her voice. The bakery erupted into applause, laughter, and a flurry of orders from customers eager to try Margaret's special loaf. Thomas smiled, feeling a warmth that no fire could ever take away. It was the warmth of a place that was not just rebuilt, but reborn. The days that followed were nothing short of miraculous. The bakery, once a place that people passed by without much thought, became the heart of the neighborhood again. Mornings were filled with the soft rustle of newspapers, the clinking of cups, and the hearty laughter of friends catching up over coffee and pastries. Thomas, now more energetic and full of purpose than anyone had seen in years, greeted each customer by name, his eyes shining with a joy that seemed to melt the years away. Lisa had become his unofficial apprentice, learning each of Margaret's recipes with the precision and reverence they deserved. Her once indifferent attitude was replaced with enthusiasm and warmth. The regulars who had witnessed her initial coldness now spoke of her with a newfound respect. One morning, as Thomas and Lisa worked side by side, John entered the bakery, his face lit with a smile as he watched the two collaborate. "Looks like business is booming," he remarked, the pride in his voice unmistakable. Thomas wiped his flour-dusted hands on his apron and grinned at John. "Thanks to you, John. If it weren't for your kindness, I wouldn't be standing here today." John waved off the praise with a humble chuckle. "It wasn't just me, Thomas. Everyone here wanted to see this place thrive again. You built more than a bakery all those years ago. You built a community." At that, an elderly woman named Martha, who had been a customer for as long as anyone could remember, stepped up to the counter with a twinkle in her eye. "Thomas, do you remember when you'd sneak an extra cookie into the kids' bags? My grandkids still talk about those days." Thomas laughed, the sound deep and genuine. "Of course, Martha. Margaret always said a little extra sweetness went a long way." The mention of Margaret's name no longer brought just a pang of sorrow. It brought warmth and a bittersweet fondness. Thomas's gaze turned toward the photograph Harold had given him, now framed and hanging on the wall above the counter. Margaret's smile, frozen in time, seemed to watch over the room, blessing it with her presence. "Mr. Thomas," Lisa said, breaking into his thoughts, "I think it's time we put up the sign." Thomas's eyes widened in surprise. He had forgotten about the old wooden sign that used to hang above the bakery's entrance. It had been found in storage, dust-covered and worn, but Lisa had spent hours restoring it, repainting the elegant lettering that spelled out "Pays due Thomas, the taste of memories." The bakery grew quiet as John and Lisa lifted the sign and positioned it above the entrance. Thomas stood by, his hands clasped and eyes glistening as he watched it being secured in place. When they stepped back, the room erupted in cheers and applause. "Welcome back," Harold said, his voice breaking slightly as he patted Thomas on the back. Other voices echoed, "Welcome home," and "We missed this." The sign swayed gently, as if nodding in agreement, and Thomas felt a surge of emotions so powerful that he had to wipe his eyes discreetly. The bakery was more than just four walls and an oven. It was the embodiment of resilience, memory, and the countless acts of kindness that had defined his life and those around him. As the cheers died down, Thomas cleared his throat, the room's attention shifting back to him. "Thank you, all of you, for bringing life back to this place. Margaret would have been proud to see what we've done together. And I think No, I know that as long as this bakery stands, we'll keep building memories one loaf at a time. A wave of warmth swept through the crowd, and for a moment, there was no past or future, just the present, rich with connection and shared purpose. Outside, the sun shone brightly, casting its golden light over the sign that now gleamed with a renewed promise. The bakery hummed with life, the steady rhythm of conversation and laughter blending with the scent of cinnamon and warm bread. Thomas moved with newfound vigor, guiding Lisa through the subtleties of another classic recipe while John mingled with customers, exchanging smiles and stories. The community had embraced the rebirth of the bakery as a symbol of unity and resilience. One late afternoon, as the golden light filtered through the windows and cast long shadows across the floor, John approached Thomas with a thoughtful expression. He carried a small, intricately wrapped box tied with a ribbon, its presence commanding attention. "Thomas," he said, drawing the old man's eyes away from the dough he was shaping, "there's something I want you to have." Thomas wiped his hands on his apron, curiosity knitting his brows. "What's this, John?" His voice was soft, but anticipation tinged each word. John hesitated for a moment, then handed the box to Thomas. "It's something I found while looking through some old belongings. I think it belongs here. With you?" The room fell silent, the quiet only broken by the soft ticking of the old clock on the wall. Thomas carefully untied the ribbon and lifted the lid to reveal a delicate, leather-bound notebook. Its edges were worn, the pages yellowed with age. He recognized it immediately, the notebook where Margaret had meticulously recorded every recipe, idea, and note about the bakery. His fingers traced the faded lettering on the cover, as if touching a piece of her spirit. "Margaret's notebook," Thomas whispered, his eyes misting over. The memories that flooded back were both painful and sweet. He turned the pages slowly, his gaze skimming over her familiar handwriting, the flour-dusted notes that detailed recipes perfected over decades and small doodles she'd drawn in the margins. Each page was a testament to her love and creativity. John smiled, his voice barely above a whisper. "I found it in a box that belonged to my father. He must have kept it after the fire. I think he wanted to hold on to a piece of this place, just like I did." Thomas's heart tightened, overwhelmed by the thought of Margaret's recipes surviving the flames, tucked away for all those years. He looked up at John, his eyes reflecting gratitude too deep for words. "You don't know what this means to me," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. The quiet in the bakery was thick with reverence. Lisa stepped forward, unable to stay silent any longer. "Mr. Thomas, we should bake one of her recipes from the book," she said, a smile breaking across her face. As a tribute, Thomas's lips parted in a smile, his eyes still fixed on the notebook. "Yes," he nodded, his voice stronger now. "We should." The announcement brought a ripple of excitement. Customers murmured with anticipation, eager to taste a piece of the bakery's history. Harold, who had been sipping his coffee nearby, leaned in and said, "Make sure it's her famous apple cinnamon bread, Thomas. It's been too long since I've tasted that." The sun dipped lower as the kitchen came to life. Thomas's hands moved with a familiarity that felt almost divine, following Margaret's instructions as if she were there guiding him. Lisa assisted with reverence, measuring each ingredient with a precision she had learned to respect. John watched from the corner, his heart full, knowing that this moment was more than just the return of a recipe. It was the reclaiming of something that fire and time had tried to erase. As the aroma of apples and cinnamon filled the room, customers stood, leaning forward in anticipation. Thomas glanced around, seeing the eager faces and feeling Margaret's presence in every corner. He took a deep breath, the warmth of memory and love wrapping around him like a comforting embrace. When the first loaf came out of the oven, golden and perfect, a collective sigh filled the bakery. Thomas cut a slice, handing it first to Lisa, who tasted it with wide eyes. "It's like she never left," she whispered, blinking back tears. Thomas nodded, a tear escaping down his cheek as he smiled. "No, Lisa, she never did." The bakery was alive with an energy that seemed almost sacred. Word of Margaret's legendary apple cinnamon bread spread quickly through the neighborhood, drawing an even larger crowd than usual. People from all corners of the city came to taste the recipe that had once been the pride of the old bakery, now revived by Thomas's own hands. Thomas stood behind the counter, apron dusted with flour, and a smile that seemed to erase years from his face. The leather-bound notebook sat on a shelf above the register, its presence a quiet testament to the history woven into the very fabric of the bakery. John watched the scene with satisfaction, the familiar warmth of contentment spreading through him as he took in the joyful chaos. "Thomas, you've done it again," Harold said, taking a bite of the bread and closing his eyes as if savoring a memory. "It tastes just like I remember." Thomas's smile widened as he served another customer. "That's what I was hoping for, Harold. It's not just bread. It's a piece of the past brought to life." Lisa, who had now become more than an apprentice, worked alongside Thomas with the efficiency and confidence of someone who had found her calling. She exchanged knowing glances with Thomas as they coordinated the next batch, moving in sync as if they had been doing this for years. The shift in her demeanor did not go unnoticed by the customers, who greeted her with friendly nods and smiles. As the day unfolded, John stood up from his table and cleared his throat. The chatter in the bakery dimmed as heads turned to face him. "I think it's time we all know just how much Thomas and this bakery mean to this community," John began. His voice, strong and steady, filled the room. "Thomas has given us more than we could ever repay. And now, it's time to ensure that this place thrives for many more generations." Murmurs of agreement swept through the crowd. Thomas looked at John, curiosity flickering in his eyes. John took a step closer to the counter, producing a folder from his briefcase and placing it in front of Thomas. "This is for you," he said, a smile breaking through his typically composed expression. Thomas hesitated before opening the folder, his fingers brushing over the crisp paper. Inside were documents for full ownership of the bakery, free of any debt or financial strain. He glanced up at John, his breath catching in his chest. "John, I don't understand." John's smile grew as he explained. "I made sure that the debts this bakery carried were cleared. This place belongs to you again, Thomas, without any worries. And it's not just me. It's everyone here who chipped in, even if just a little. Because this bakery is more than a business. It's a piece of us all." A wave of emotion swept through the room. Some customers clapped, others wiped away tears. Lisa's eyes shimmered as she reached out to squeeze Thomas's hand. The old man's throat tightened, and for a moment, he couldn't find the words. You did this for me?" Thomas finally managed, his voice cracking with disbelief and gratitude. The nods and murmurs of affirmation that followed brought a smile that broke through his tears. "I don't know how to thank you." Harold, from the back, raised his cup of coffee in a toast. "You already have, Thomas. Every day, with every loaf and every smile." The room erupted in applause, the kind that felt like a collective embrace. Thomas stood taller than he had in years, looking around at the faces, some familiar and others new, all united by the stories and memories they shared within these walls. The bakery was not just his again, it was theirs, an enduring symbol of kindness, resilience, and the power of community. As the noise settled and customers resumed their conversations, John leaned in closer to Thomas. "You once said that you weren't sure if the rest of the story could be written," John said, a twinkle in his eye. "I think we're all here to help you write it." Thomas nodded, emotion still thick in his voice. "Yes, John, and I have a feeling the best chapters are still to come. The next morning, the bakery was bathed in the soft glow of dawn. Thomas stood outside, taking in the sight of his beloved shop as it caught the first rays of sunlight. The sign above, freshly polished, gleamed with a renewed sense of purpose. Pays due Thomas. The taste of memories. The streets were quiet, a moment of calm before the bustling day began. Inside, Lisa was already preparing the first batch of dough, moving with the ease and confidence of someone who had grown into her role. The scent of flour and cinnamon filled the air, wrapping around Thomas like a warm embrace. He stepped inside, his heart full as he watched Lisa work. "You're doing it just like Margaret would have," he said, his voice filled with pride. Lisa turned, a wide smile lighting up her face. "I had the best teacher," she replied, her eyes meeting Thomas's with an understanding that spoke volumes. The two shared a moment of quiet gratitude, the kind that needs no words. John entered a few minutes later, carrying a basket of fresh apples and nodding a greeting to both. "I brought these for today's special. Thought it might be fitting to keep Margaret's apple cinnamon bread on the menu as a tribute," he said. Thomas's eyes sparkled. "A perfect idea, John. Thank you." As the morning unfolded, customers began to trickle in, the little bell above the door chiming with each new arrival. They greeted Thomas with cheerful hellos and warm handshakes, and some even brought stories of how the bakery had been a part of their lives. An elderly woman recalled buying her wedding cake here decades ago, while a young couple shared that they'd had their first date over coffee and pastries at one of the corner tables. The bakery had become more than a place to buy bread. It was a gathering spot where stories were shared and new memories were forged. The scent of fresh-baked loaves and laughter mingled, creating an atmosphere that was as comforting as it was vibrant. As the day drew on, a reporter from a local newspaper arrived, intrigued by the buzz surrounding the bakery's revival. She sat down with Thomas, notepad in hand, eager to hear the story that had brought the community together. "Mr. Thomas, what's the secret to creating a place that means so much to so many people?" she asked. Thomas paused, his gaze drifting to the framed photograph of him and Margaret. He smiled softly, the memories cascading over him like waves. "The secret is simple," he said, meeting the reporter's eyes. "It's love. Love in every loaf, every smile, and every act of kindness. Margaret and I built this place with love, and it's love that brought it back to life." The reporter scribbled furiously, capturing the heart of his words. Lisa, who had been listening from behind the counter, felt her chest swell with pride. John, leaning in the doorway, watched as customers continued to flow in, each bringing with them stories and connections that added to the fabric of the bakery's legacy. That evening, as the last customer left and the sun set, casting warm hues across the street, Thomas stood at the window, watching the world outside. Lisa and John joined him, the three of them taking in the peaceful scene. The glow of street lamps lit up the sidewalk, and the scent of fresh bread lingered in the air, a promise of new days to come. "Thank you, both of you," Thomas said, his voice steady, yet full of emotion, "for helping me find my way back here." John placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "We didn't just help you, Thomas. You helped all of us remember what really matters." Lisa nodded, eyes shining. "And we're not done yet. There are more recipes to bake, more stories to tell." Thomas's smile deepened, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Yes, there are. And with you both here, I know this place will keep going long after I'm gone. Margaret's dream will live on." The three stood in silence for a moment, the bond between them as strong as the walls that surrounded them. The bakery had been reborn, not just as a place of business, but as a testament to the enduring power of community, love, and second chances. As they turned off the lights and locked up for the night, Thomas took one last look at the sign above the door. The words shimmered in the glow of the street lamps, a beacon of hope that would guide many more through its doors in the days to come. If you enjoyed this story and would like to hear new ones every day, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep sharing stories that warm the heart and inspire the soul.